General Omar Bradley once said, "Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics." The New Mexico campaign of the Civil War between 1861 and 1862 is a prime example of how logistics trump tactics. A recent series about the Confederate invasion of New Mexico was originally to be a four-part series: an introduction, the story of Fort Craig, the Battle of Val Verde, and the Battle of Glorieta Pass. As I was completing Series 4, I realized I needed to do another episode to expand and wrap up the campaign. First, we have to look at the geography of New Mexico and the Southwest. While the geography hasn't changed, modern technology has mitigated many of the difficulties that the Union and Confederate armies faced in 1862. In the 1860s, New Mexico was a vast, semi-arid, sparsely populated land. Avenues of travel and settlement were centered on location of water. The need of a large collection of men and horses could not be locally produced, but had to be transported in. That transportation link was long, dangerous, and fragile. The most secure route was the 870-mile-long Santa Fe Trail from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico. From Santa Fe, a less secure route went south to Albuquerque and along the Rio Grande to Texas and Mexico. From the New Mexico, Texas, Mexico boundary, a stage route ran 550 miles to San Antonio through mostly desert country. Without supplies and a secure supply train, military success was going to be difficult or impossible. General Sibley based his success in New Mexico on three false assumptions. The first was that the Union forces in the territory were weak, demoralized, and would offer little resistance. While this proved true at Fort Fillmore and Fort Staunton, it was not true elsewhere. Second was that he believed a large number of Confederate sympathizers would join the Army. This also was not true. Probably less than 200 men joined the Confederate Army. Third assumption was that he could live off of federal supplies from the forts in the New Mexico territory. It is true that the Confederates had the supplies from the forts between San Antonio and New Mexico, and were able to obtain supplies from Fort Fillmore and Fort Staunton. They were also able to get supplies from the forts and depots north of Fort Craig, but not enough for a sustained campaign. As the Battle of Glorieta Pass demonstrated, logistics was the Confederates' Achilles' heel. The Battle of Glorieta Pass, while a tactical Confederate victory, was a logistical disaster. The Confederates had lost almost all of their food, equipment, and even worse, they did not have enough ammunition to fight another battle. Colonel Scurry had no choice but to fall back onto Santa Fe, leaving behind, because of a lack of transportation, many of his sick and wounded. Into this humanitarian crisis, came the Angel of Santa Fe, Louisa Canby, the wife of the Union commander of New Mexico, Colonel, now General, Edwin Canby. Mrs. Canby, touched by the suffering of the many sick and wounded men, organized the women of Santa Fe to care for them. She brought many wounded into her own home, organized the recovery of men left on the battlefield, and regularly visited those who were too injured to be moved, providing them with aid and comfort. When she realized the soldiers were freezing for lack of blankets and clothing, she revealed a secret cache of supplies and distributed them to the Confederate troops. Sibley concentrated the remainder of the army in Albuquerque, while Canby united his army to the east of the town. Sibley, outnumbered and fearing of being surrounded, withdrew from Albuquerque along the Rio Grande. The men on foot on the west side of the river and the mounted troops under Colonel Greene acting as a screen on the east. Greene, on the night of April the 13th, halted his men at the little village of Peralta. On the morning of the 14th, the Confederate troops were rudely awakened by a volley of musket fire. Greene, thinking Canby was far behind him, had failed to place pickets. The Confederates were in excellent defensive position, however. The village was built of thick adobe buildings and walls surrounded with irrigation ditches. Canby was unwilling to risk a frontal assault on such a strong position. The day was spent with both sides engaged in ineffective artillery duel. During the mid-afternoon, an intense sandstorm occurred, effectively ending the battle. That night, the Confederates slipped across the river and continued their retreat south. Canby soon took up pursuit, and for the next day, the two armies shadowed each other from across the flooded Rio Grande. Once again, the Army of New Mexico was in a dire situation. Sibley realized he could not outrun Canby's army, and ahead of him was the Union-held Fort Craig. The army could be trapped. The alternative was to turn west and march along the east side of the San Mateo Mountains. It was a rugged, roadless, mountainous, almost waterless 108-mile detour. The men would take only what they could carry. All but 3 wagons and 9 guns were abandoned. Eventually, except for 6 cannon, they also would be left behind. For 1 week, the men and animals suffered terribly, sometimes going for days without water. They were successful, however, in eluding the Federal Army. For a brief time, Canby was confused by the Confederate disappearance, but came to realize, after scouts' reports, the Confederates were in full retreat. Canby reached Fort Craig and stopped his army. He could have encountered the Confederates when they reached the Rio Grande, but he chose not to, much to the chagrin of several of his officers. The Union Army, however, was having problems of its own. Supplies were weeks to the rear, and already the army was on half rations. Canby simply did not have the means to feed thousands of Confederate prisoners. The Confederates, having reached Mesilla, established themselves in camps along the Rio Grande, below Fort Craig and above Fort Bliss. Active campaigning for the Army of New Mexico was effectively over. In February 1862, Colonel Baylor sent Lieutenant Sherard Hunter with 54 men, later increased to 74, to Tucson. Tucson, in early 1862, was an island of white and Hispanic settlers in a sea of hostile Apaches. Hunter's mission was not to protect the settlers, but to make contact with a supposedly active Confederate underground in California and watch for Union forces coming from the state. Hunter rode west and discovered the Federals had been stockpiling hay and grain along the way in anticipation for their advance to the Rio Grande. Along the way, he captured, without firing a shot, a 9-man Union patrol. 89 miles from the Colorado River, Hunter's men exchanged shots with Union pickets. Thus, the fight at Stanwix Station became what some declare the most Western conflict of the Civil War. Hunter returned to Tucson, leaving an advance patrol at Picacho Peak, north of Tucson, to observe for Union troops. General James Carlton, commander of the 2,000-man California column, was a slow and cautious man. The loss of his fodder stockpiles and Confederate activity east of the Colorado River greatly slowed his advance. On April 15th, a Union patrol under Lieutenant James Barnett surprised the Confederates at Picacho Peak and demanded they surrender. The Confederates were prepared to surrender when Barnett started shooting. The Confederates returned the fire, killing Barnett along with 2 other men and wounding 4 more. The Confederate force, minus 3 men captured, returned to Tucson. The brief skirmish at Picacho Peak caused Carlton to fall back 100 miles and delayed his advance to Tucson for a month. Meanwhile, on May 15th, Hunter prepared to evacuate Tucson. He sent a small force with Union prisoners, cattle, and horses ahead. This detachment was attacked by about 100 Apache warriors at Dragoon Springs. The Apaches killed 4 men and captured the cattle and the horses. A few days later, Captain Hunter attacked the Apaches, killing 5 and recapturing the animals. Carlton occupied Tucson on May the 20th, where he remained for another month before moving to New Mexico. For a month following the retreat from Santa Fe, the Army of New Mexico eked an existence in its camps along the Rio Grande between Mesilla and Fort Bliss. Sibley remained at his headquarters at Fort Bliss, waiting for supplies and reinforcements that would never come. Finally, forced by his officers, he ordered a retreat to San Antonio. The army suffered another torturous march until it reached San Antonio, where it was disbanded. Union troops eventually advanced into Texas, but never east of the Pecos River. The Southwest was now safely in Union hands. For the next couple of years, Southern spies and agents operated in the area, but never posed a serious threat. The Federal Army in New Mexico spent the rest of the war fighting the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Navajo. At this point, you may be wondering what happened to several of the major participants of the New Mexico campaign. Major John Shivington became the colonel of the 1st Colorado Volunteer Cavalry, and in November 1864, he led his men, plus 2 other regiments, on an attack of a somewhat peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapaho, killing between 150 and 230 Indians, mostly women and children. Shivington was condemned by the U.S. Congress for his actions, but because of political manipulation, no action was taken against him. He spent the next 30 years of his life doing various jobs, but his goal of achieving political fame and power were destroyed. Colonel John Slough resigned from the Army shortly after the Battle of Glorieta Pass. He went east, rejoined the Army, and fought against Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. He spent the remainder of the war in administrative positions. Edwin Canby was reassigned east in the late 1862 and spent much of the war in administrative positions. In 1864, he commanded the Union forces assigned to capture Mobile, Alabama. He held several commands in the South during Reconstruction. He was killed in 1873 by Modocs at a peace parley. General James Carlton took over command of the New Mexico Territory, replacing General Canby. Carlton spent the war in New Mexico fighting Indians. Major Charles Pyron remained in the Confederate Army, fighting in East Texas and becoming a colonel. Lieutenant Colonel William Scurry also remained in the Confederate Army, eventually becoming a brigadier general. He helped recapture Galveston, Texas, and assisted in the preventing the Union Army from invading Texas during the Red River Campaign. He was killed at the Battle of Jenkins Ferry, Arkansas in 1864. Colonel Tom Green became a brigadier general and fought in the Red River Campaign. In 1864, he was killed leading an attack on Federal gunboats in the Red River. Brigadier General Henry Sibley was given a minor command in southern Louisiana. In 1863, he was court-martialed for cowardice. Although not convicted, he was censured. After the war, he served in the Egyptian army from 1870 to 1873, when he was dismissed due to illness and disability. He returned to Virginia and died in 1874. The Civil War in New Mexico was a sideshow to the governments in Washington and Richmond, more so to Richmond, since the Confederacy had neither the money nor the manpower to sustain a lengthy campaign in the far west. The conflict was located in a distant frontier, in a desert environment, and by Civil War standards, on a small scale. Both sides operated thousands of miles from their supply base. Uniquely, it was a three-sided conflict between the major combatants, Confederate and Union soldiers, and the local Indians. The conflict included a degree of civility not usually seen in civil wars. At the conclusion of each battle, Val Verde and Glorieta Pass, a truce was called, and both sides recovered their wounded and buried their dead. Like General Greene in the American Revolution, the victor was tactically defeated in every engagement, yet still drove the invader from its territory.